All right, let me go ahead and get us going. I'm mindful of time, and I'm just so glad that everyone is here. And I'll start us with just a brief word of introduction for the evening. First, my name is Jeremy Rutledge, and I am senior pastor at Circular Congregational Church. And I'm just really delighted to have my dear friend, Rabbi Stephanie Alexander, with us this evening. This is our monthly conversation in theology and ethics. And we've done a number of different things. We often are reading a book or studying a theologian or ethicist, and we're changing it up for a few months. And I've decided to invite some of my very favorite people to have conversations with us. These are basically people that we know, local clergy, who are also theologians and ethicists in their own right and in the work they do, people that I love and admire. So it's a special, this is just really something I've been looking forward to. I'm glad each of you is here. And after our event this evening is over, it will be posted on YouTube. If you'd like to hear it again or share it with someone, we encourage you to do that. So let me just say a quick word about the format of our evening, and then I'll do the introduction. These conversations last no more than an hour and a half, but that's the sort of time allotted. But often we may talk for 30 or 45 minutes and then open it up for questions and just see what kind of conversation we have. And so it could be an hour or an hour and 15 minutes. It will be a good conversation and one that I think moves right along, and then we'll just go from there. So throughout the evening, Stephanie and I will start with some conversation, and if you have a question at any time, just put your name in the chat. And the chat function, if you are new to Zoom, if you look at the bar down at the very bottom of your screen, there's an icon that says chat. You can just type in your name. And then when it comes to time for questions and conversations, I would just call on you by name and you can ask your question and join us in the conversation. So I hope that makes sense. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and we'll do our best to get to you as well. So a question about the format, I mean, and those kinds of things. Okay. So here's a brief introduction. Rabbi Stephanie Alexander is the senior rabbi at Kadal Kadosh Beth Elohim, KKBE, the oldest Reform synagogue in the country. She's a graduate of Tulane University and the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Rabbi Stephanie played a founding role in our Charleston area justice ministry, CAJM, in 2011. She and KKBE were instrumental in its beginning. She has served on the CAJM board and also as its co-president. Rabbi Stephanie is married to Rabbi Aaron Sherman, who serves as a spiritual leader to Temple Beth El in Florence, South Carolina, and also as a Jewish chaplain here in Charleston. They are the proud parents of Eli, who I may say with our church. Our congregations have long worked together to make our community a more just, inclusive, and peaceful place to live. On a personal note, I'd like to add that Stephanie is one of my favorite people. She was the first person I called on my first day as pastor of Circular Church. I introduced myself over the telephone and said that I was a St. Louis Cardinals fan. Say more about that, she replied. We've been friends ever since. Friends, it's a delight to have my dear friend, Rabbi Stephanie Alexander, as our guest for tonight's conversation in theology and ethics. Welcome, Stephanie, and welcome, friends. We're so glad that you're all here, but especially you, Stephanie, as our guest.
Jeremy, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's an honor and literally the least I can do since you've graced us at KKBE with your presence and conversation at least once, if not multiple times before. I'm honored to be able to reciprocate tonight.
Thanks. Well, and I hope this will be fun. I have way too many questions, but I don't want it to be like an interview or an interrogation. It's also a conversation among friends. So if you have questions, you can toss them back to me or the group, and we'll enjoy the conversation together. So um, yeah, so I started with just things you and I might talk about anyway. Um, and the sort of obvious one just being, how are you at the moment? I think, did Hanukkah end on maybe the 6th or so, just a few days ago? And we're in the middle of a busy time, but how are you and how are things?
And well, this has been a very busy time, but in the scheme of things, as we can all appreciate, having just been through the ringer for so long right now, it's been very busy with poo poo poo. I'm an incredibly superstitious person. Such positive things for several weeks right now. As Jeremy knows, because he was able to be there, and a couple of others on the screen here as well. We celebrated my son's bar mitzvah, becoming bar mitzvah a few weeks ago, the week before Thanksgiving, which was the highlight of my life, honestly, to this point. And then Thanksgiving, and then our congregation celebrated a tremendous milestone in our history just last weekend in rededicating our sanctuary. We had just completed $1 million restoration and renovation project inside the sanctuary, soft opened for one Shabbat before we closed down for COVID. So we have not been able to be in there together. We still have significant limitations, but knowing that the festival of Hanukkah is a festival of rededication, that that's what it marks. It was just perfect to line that up together. And so we had a weekend's worth of variety of special activities that brought together so many different constituencies within our congregation. And then topped off with my first wedding of a former confirmation student of mine, which I'm choosing to read as it doesn't mean I'm old, it just means I'm established. That's how I'm choosing to read that. But so just truly a string of joys. So I'm doing well, Jeremy. How are you?
Um, Actually, very well, all things considered. I think it's been,
Thank God.
I seem to be gauging everything. I'm comparing it to the past 22 months, but this seems like a time of some real hope, I think. Not an easy hope. I mean, there's still a lot to be concerned about and to take very seriously, but um, I think almost all of the people on this call know that I'm one of the immunocompromised, and it's been a tough time. And there are some very promising therapies and some good reasons to think that next year is going to be a better year. So um, that that has put a spring in our step, particularly some of the new therapies that are on the way. So
So grateful for
that's the
that.
short version, but all is well, or as well as it's been in a long time. So
Right.
um, cool. Well, I mentioned that I had written down a bunch of questions just so that we would have good things to talk about. And then I realized that the first question could take the whole time, which is, what are you reading? And that could be, what are you reading, at the moment, or were there high points in your reading year, particular books that will stand out? And I know that is a tough question. So, or for people like us, it could take a long time.
So it
So
is a tough question, but knowing that it would, of course, be one of the questions that you would ask this evening gave me occasion to go back through my list. And I apologize for those of you who hear a dog in the background. Are we hearing that? It
just
should stop. There's family on that. He does not like attention being away from him from 7 to 9 p.m. Completely inconvenient, but he'll calm down. Um, so I keep a list of the books that I read because I read and I forget. And one of the things I lament, and you're probably so much better at this than I am, Jeremy, is I don't take enough time to process what I've read and really solidify it and integrate it into the things that I'm thinking about. But I do keep a good list with some triggers attached so that I can go back and remind myself. And because I had some sabbatical time over the summer, this has been a big reading year for me. So I did pull out some of the highlights, and I know you've already put out your top 10 list for the year. I wait until December 30th at the earliest, because I give myself till the end of the year to do that. But in the meantime, I enjoy all of the other lists that come out. This is my favorite month. Everybody's sending their top tens of everything. I feel like I've got my to-do list for the next decade. But one of my favorite books that I read was in the first month of this year, back in January, John Thompson's autobiography, the longtime basketball coach at University of Georgetown, or Georgetown University. And I lament that he passed away just before the book was published, and we didn't get the benefit of watching him do the tour and just
Oh,
hearing him talk throughout this past year. But I was so moved. Once you get past the language, he writes the exact same way that he coached, so you got to get past that. Um, so moved by the way that he impacted the lives of the individuals that he coached, and the way that those that he coached impacted his life tremendously. The impact he had on the city of Washington, D.C., and the ways in which so much of his life associated with basketball had absolutely nothing to do with basketball, though I love
mm,
basketball. So every element of that book spoke to me. I do love memoirs. I do love when you get these glimpses in depth, just of people that you've only known in one way, and you get to see them in so many others. So that one stood out to me. There were some books that I read for preaching purposes. Usually I've got a topic or two I head into the summer with, thinking about the high holidays coming up. And one of the topics I was really focused on this year was humility, was knowing that somehow that has to play significantly into whatever comes next for us as a nation, if we want it to be not a continuation of where we are now. So I did a lot of reading, different thinkers focusing on humility. And Adam Grant, though a little um, popular in his writing sometimes than what I'm drawn to, his book, what was it called exactly again? The Power of Knowing What You
mm,
Don't Know. Another author that being able to hold on to a learned sense of ignorance, and embracing that and staying with it. So his work left a mark on me. And actually, that other author was Rachel Mikva. This was a book I had mentioned to you, Jeremy, at one point. Dangerous Religious Ideals. I think we both saw it in the New York Times at some point. The Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I have to admit, this probably even won't go on my list because I didn't read the whole book. I didn't read the Christianity and the Islam parts. And I apologize for that. I skimmed a little bit. I don't give myself credit for the reading on the list if I haven't done the whole thing. But um, what she had some amazing things about that learned ignorance, about um, instead of having moral certainty, maintaining moral confidence, that
mm,
but letting go of the certainty. um, and then the way that she traced that through the Jewish tradition, and I assume she did the same thing with the other faiths. That's not new. It's something that's embedded in our tradition, and so we can claim that as an authentic part of what our tradition is all about. And in being a little more open, a little less certain, a little more humble in our faith, and in lots of other areas, we're actually really exemplifying what our faith is at its very core. So those made a mark. And then the other one I underscored was called, I think, Growing Up on Bank Street or something like that, about one street in Greenwich Village. And this author that just in her childhood, her last name was Florio. I didn't write this one down. Donna Florio, I think. Um, all of these amazing people, some famous, many not, but all characters in their own right, and all on this one small one block street that she grew up in, on Greenwich Village. I love um, I love concept books. I love things that just take one particular idea and then just drill down deeply into them and explore all layers and all people attached to it. And it was just a fantastic example of that kind of book. So those were some of the ones that stood out. Um, there's the stack that's here of the ones I'm looking forward to reading next. And also I have saved for myself the holiday books book review from the New York Times from last weekend, because I just feel like there's going to be so much more that I want to dive into there. So I'm saving it as a treat for when I run dry. But
You-
how about you? What are you reading right now?
Um, well, I'm going very slowly because I'm enjoying it. Through Rebecca Solnit's book about George Orwell. It's called Orwell's Roses, and it talks a lot about his time in the natural world and his time in the garden, how that sense of connection informed his political struggles. And
Mm,
it's a side of Orwell that you never hear about, or that I've I've read him and read about him for a long time, but um, he comes off sounding like Thoreau, in this.
mm,
She's such a beautiful
yeah.
essayist. She'll digress and take you on a tour of what roses have meant, and how they've been cultivated and what they were given for and things like that. So that's a delightful read. And I'll only add one more, else it will never end. But one of my favorite books of the year was a book entitled A World on the Wing. And it was about I'm not calling up the subtitle at this moment, but it's about um, the global migration of birds, and it's written by a man who beautiful it is, and how far these fragile birds can travel, and what their bodies can do to get them from one place to the other. It's extraordinary, their migrations, but it's also a very difficult book because birds don't have borders. And so they're just looking for habitats. And as their habitats are destroyed, they're having a hard time. And that's putting it mildly. But that book made a huge impression on me. And this is leading into another fun question. But I also read that book in the summer on vacation when I woke up before everyone else and made coffee and went outside. And so I associate that book with rest, with
Mhm.
that quiet, that morning quiet, and just the delight of knowing that you can read and you're not supposed to be anywhere else or doing anything else. And I wondered if you had favorite times or ways to read as well.
I am the exact opposite of you. um, I'm a nighttime reader, and I'll read during the day. I'll read anytime I can read, but I think it comes from being an introvert. That by the time I get to the end of the day, I have to spend time in my own headspace to be able to regroup, and I can't delay that to the next morning. I need that in that day to know that the next day I'm going to be rejuvenated and have more energy. But if the book is really good, of course, the danger is the hours tick by and I'm still with it. So then I'm drained again for physical reasons, not emotional ones at the start of the next day. It's a vicious cycle. Um, but so yeah, I'm just in the evening, and cozied up and maybe with some tea or something. My dog snuggled in and whatever I've got there.
Cool. I admire people who can read seriously at night. I'm
Hmm.
just sleepy. that and so I read all the important stuff that I need to focus on or in the morning.
Yeah.
And at night, it's usually just New Yorker cartoons for me. Because if I drop that, it's fine. Nobody's gonna get hurt.
I feel like New Yorker cartoons are amongst the most serious things that I read. I mean, the depth of what's conveyed there. But actually, I started a new trick where, and my apologies to anyone who picks up a library book after I've used it. The dog ears are mine. I'm very, very sorry. I try and crease them out as best that I can, and I'll use Post-its too. But um, I was like a prolific underliner, and all of my reading was happening so laboriously that I've taken to just marking a page when something strikes me, or putting a post-it in there, finishing the book, going back, and if I can't recognize on the page what touched me when I started, it wasn't that important anyway. But my attention is drawn to it on that second glance, then I have a separate place where I jot it down, and that's kind of speeded up at least a little bit. And at night, it takes the pressure off of having to really be focused word to word so much. If the sense of something moves me or resonates, then I'll just kind of flag it.
Cool. Well, I mean, here's to the public library is what I draw from that. We all we all do our things, and we in this house, and it's maybe true of many on this call, we try to support all our local bookstores and our libraries at the same time. So,
Yep.
and our good reporters and other periodicals. So here's to all the authors. And yeah, I just had to put that plug in because there's so many good things to read. Um, and it doesn't ever take any convincing for me to spend money on things to read. So I think money is also for other things, but I don't know what. so, um,
The things that
so
make you more cuddly while you're reading the books. Like it's all about supporting that endeavor.
okay, yeah, that all sounds good. All the accoutrements, we could
That's right.
say. Um, well, and just for fun, these are a couple of just silly questions, and then I have some less, some more uh, thoughtful questions. But it's fun to think about people we know and see in public roles in different ways. So Stephanie, what if you had a day off and you are not in a public role, what's your perfect day off? What's good for you and or delightful for you to do?
So I try and make those Mondays, and I try and as best as possible do keep that, so I get that every week. The perfect day off doesn't have an alarm clock at the beginning. Then starts with some kind of physical activity or exercise. Most likely, though, it's going to be with a trainer or someone, or that even though I know it's part of the perfect day, it's going to get skipped over. Um, then it's just quiet. It's a day in which I can stay in jeans from start to finish and not have to dress up for anything. Very important. Um, Ideally, the weather is perfect, so I can be on the porch. And I got one of those swinging. We call it the nest. I think they're called like egg chairs or something like that. Um, with with a good drink and the book. And then really important is that I get to be the one who picks Eli up from school. And in pre-COVID world, we always on Mondays would have a standing date at the coffee shop. So generally speaking, both of us, or he would finish up whatever homework he had for the day, and then he would have a book, and I'd have a book, and we just be there together for a bit. And then some kind of sports, spectator sport in the evening on TV, or if there were a College of Charleston game in town or something like that. That's the perfect day for me, start to finish. I guess Aaron would have to be in there too. This is being recorded, right? So there's a chance he would watch it.
Yeah.
Aaron would definitely be a part of that day. We'll just assume that he's there and we don't have
Right.
to fit him in anywhere special.
That's how I pictured it. Yeah, I can see the
Exactly.
whole thing. Well, and along this question comes from a funny place, but it's a sort of a guilty pleasure question. And it comes from this place. I called MUSC to make an appointment about something the other week and had the funniest conversation with the scheduler, who, upon learning my birthday, launched into a discussion of 80s pop music and her intense love for the Canadian band Loverboy, right? And we had the funniest conversation. And I thought, wow, this is shameless. How long we're going on about Loverboy. And I admired her guilty pleasure that she shared with me. And then uh, it took me a week to get the Loverboy songs out of my head. So I'm hoping your answer won't do something like that. But do you have guilty pleasures that,
I,
you know,
I I
food or
tend not to
television
feel,
shows or
yeah,
activity music?
I tend not to feel guilty about my pleasures. I feel like they are well earned and much
Yeah.
deserved, and I enjoy. But I guess maybe one of the more surprising activities that I enjoy. It's no big deal. It's just, I mean, it's dorky, but I really love jigsaw puzzles. I love working puzzles. I find them comforting, and I look forward to when I am on a vacation, and my mother's the only one who'll work them with me, but having a new puzzle and being able to work that together. I don't feel guilty about it, but it does seem somewhat trivial compared to the other activities that one could be doing, but I enjoy it.
It's uh, so I yeah, we discovered puzzles in the last few years, and they seem so good for our brains. I'm not sure what I mean by that. There's calming to do a puzzle. And sometimes, do you work them alone or with others, or
If
that's
it's
a
here, it's
vacation
just me. No one would do
yeah.
it with me. My mother will do it with me someplace else, but I don't know if it's so good for my brain. I find that when I've been doing it for a long time, I start to see patterns and everything. Like I'll look at my dog's fur and I'm seeing shapes that I'm like, oh, look, he's stitched together somehow. Um, I don't know, but I like it.
I just have to ask before moving to the
Hmm.
slightly more serious, what's your largest puzzle? What's your maximum
I
number of
like
puzzle pieces?
I like to do 1,000. I don't. I guess I could do larger, but that's my favorite number. And I'm very um, I'm stuck up about the brands that I use. I hate the ones that are flimsy and the paper's peeling
Mm.
off and they don't fit perfectly, or they're all the same shape, and you're just no, no. So I've got my certain brands that I feel comfortable with, and I'll splurge on that. There you go. That's something that money has to go toward every now and then.
Okay. So, and people can reach out to you privately if they need puzzle recommendations, right?
That's right. Or I'll reach out to the companies and see if I can get signed up for endorsements.
Right. So, favorite puzzle company.
That's right.
Um, what?
Ravensburger, I'm looking at you.
Oh, okay. Um, yeah, good stuff. And well, yeah, I'm not very good at puzzles. Other people in this house are much better at puzzles. But then I become attached to them and think, so much went into that. Should we take it apart? Other people are much easier about just, well, we finished it. Now it's time to break it apart. Um, there's a metaphor there, but
There is. I think the biggest metaphor with puzzles, and this is true, and I've thought about this when I work them. There is something about opening a box, and it looks like it's going to be impossible. It looks like there's absolutely no way you're ever going to be able to do this, and yet you put one piece with the next, and you find the next, and it gets done. And there is something that is very affirming about doing that. And when you look at, when you start to, if you work by color and it looks like, okay, this whole section is just green. But as you get into it, you start to see the shades. They start to differentiate themselves a little bit more. And somehow it's just clear always that there's one more piece that can fit in until it's done. So I guess that piece maybe, um, not to be too heavy in the puzzle section of our interview, but maybe that's part of what draws me to it.
it's cool. Well, that is the best, I think maybe the most inspiring part of the metaphor anyway. And I'm the same way with crosswords, actually. I'll find a crossword that I think, I get, 4 or 5 of them to start and think, this is impossible. I'll never do this. And then an hour later, or whatever, I'm not the fastest, an hour later I'm done and think, wow, maybe not an hour, but you know what I mean? So,
Yeah,
um, well,
it's
I
affirming.
think it really is. And um, yeah, sometimes sitting with a problem for a while is okay. And it sort of reveals itself in a different way. Um, so one of my favorite, I think I shared this with you, Stephanie. One thing I've loved with all of the theologians in Ephesus that we've actually brought to Circular as a part of our lecture series or people we've studied is kind of learning some of their personal history and story.
Hmm.
And so I'll use just an example. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza is the theologian that we had with us. And when we learned the story of her girlhood growing up in the ruins of Germany after World War II, then her theology, which was deeply opposed to empire, made a lot of sense. You could see the little girl in the ruins growing up to critique empires and the abuse of power. That's one example.
Hmm.
Or Albert Rabateau was with us, and he's done so much. May he rest in peace, Professor Rabateau. But when he was with us, he told the story about how his father was murdered by a white man in Mississippi, and then his entire career um, really had to do with theology and race in America. But you could hear the voice of that boy who grew up in Mississippi um, under Jim Crow and what it was like for him. And you could still hear the pain of it in his voice. And I name those two examples just because they come to mind. But I wondered a little bit about what it was like for you growing up, or what impressions you received of the world that you think might influence the way you're a rabbi, or the way you kind of see the world and move through it. Um, it's a big question, but I think if we put it in childhood form, there's a lot to see.
Yeah. Um, and I don't know that I have a story, readily at hand to which I trace back, the journey that I'm on and the work that I do. But if I go a little later, if that's okay,
Sure.
sort of high school and college, um, when I was in high school, I mean, I grew up in classic Midwestern suburban community, rooting for the Cardinals outside St. Louis, um, very involved in my youth group in teaching, assistant teaching in the Sunday school in my congregation, where my family had belonged for at least four generations, if not more. We weren't regular worship attendees, but the synagogue was still very much at the root of our identity. It was a place that we all gravitated to together at certain times. My mother taught there. We're all there for high holidays. Eventually, my mother would go on to work there as well, but not until I was in the seminary. Um, and it was comfortable for me. And um, I had resisted getting involved in youth group until I had that classic teenage experience where I came home one day and just disavowed all my friends. I'm done with them. I need new friends. We made up, 3 days later, but I was just, and my mother just sort of gently nudged across a counter a flyer for a youth group event that I had no interest in previously. But I said, okay, yeah, I'll go meet some new people. Um, and it was pretty much a straight line from that moment into becoming on the board of the youth group. And then I was chairing what was it? It was a regional event, and it might be hard to imagine this of me, but it's 100% accurate. I was terrified of public speaking. I'm still nervous about getting up without having had the opportunity to prepare. I was terrified of opening my mouth in the public. I've shared this story before, but I would lip sync through choir concerts because I was afraid if I actually pushed sound out, that I would just like throw up on everybody. I was deeply nervous and anxious. Um, and I'm chairing this event for hundreds of teenagers I've never met before. I've never even been to one of these events, but they asked me to chair it during the Super Bowl when the Giants were playing the Bills, and it came down to one field goal kick at the end. And they pulled me aside and they said, "Do you want to do this?" And I said, "Can I go watch the game?" If I said yes, and they said yes, and so I said yes, and I watched the game. Um, so they put a microphone in front of me, and they said, "You need to make announcements to all of these people about what's coming up for the rest of the evening." And I was like, "I have to do what?" So they gave me a piece of paper with what I had to say. So I started to say, I have a few announcements. And at least in the youth group that I grew up in, and the region I grew up in, and the movement I grew up in, if you say the word announcements, there's a song. ANNOUNCEMENTS. And it goes on for like 5 minutes because everyone knows you don't say that word. And I said the word, but it was like my worst fear holding this microphone, and everyone's laughing and singing, and I'm the face of this. And yet somehow I was still breathing 2 seconds later. And when the song ended, I was still able to speak. And eventually I got those important words of instruction, I think I said, or something like that, out and conveyed to the people who needed to hear them. And having gotten through what I thought would be the worst experience I could experience was fine. And I think from that moment forward, I also just deeply associated my synagogue community, my youth group, my Jewish community as being a safe place in which I could face fears and I could work things through. So when I came out of high school, I was convinced I was going to be a rabbi. And the best example I can give is that it's like a kid who does well in school, which I also, I did pretty well in school, and you think this is a safe place and this is where I feel good. So I'm going to be a teacher. You also think you know everything that a teacher does. Of course, you only know the tip of the iceberg of what a teacher actually does. And the synagogue was that community for me. So I was going to be a rabbi. And my mother as I've famously talked about now, made an appointment with my senior rabbi in my congregation and said, talk her out of it. And he did. He encouraged me to be open-minded, and when I went off to school to explore other things. And as I got to know more parts of the Jewish community that weren't familiar to me, that didn't feel as safe because they didn't jive with what I understood Judaism to be, and I was challenged by them. I was academically preparing to be something else. But there was a pivotal moment for me. It was the summer after my sophomore year in college when I had traveled to Israel, which was also, as I look back on it, kind of amazing that I did, because I was not raised in a particularly Zionist household. Just no one in my family had traveled to Israel. We didn't travel as a family. I didn't go as a teen with my peers. I don't know, but something made me want to go. And I went. And I had a very dissonant experience while I was in Israel. I enjoyed a lot of it. I enjoyed the hiking. I enjoyed the nature. Um, I enjoyed special Jewish experiences we had in places I had learned about in my studies over there. But I was also made to feel keenly that I was a woman, young woman, and that I was reform, and that it was not just smooth and easy to just fall in love with everything that was there, and it wasn't that, then that love wasn't reciprocated all of the time. Everyone looks forward to going to the Western Wall, and there I was in a small section of a large space, and the dynamism of what was happening on the men's side of the wall, and on the women's side, it was individual experiences. You weren't allowed to raise your voice, and you could only go up, one at a time. And having to wear special clothing, being told that parts of my body were profane if they weren't covered. Just it was dissonant for me. But instead of pushing me away, when I came back, I used the resources at my university academically and in Hillel and the people that were there to explore that dissonance and to try and figure out how this could be so wrong, how it came to be that way, and how it might be righted. In fact, I wound up doing my undergraduate thesis on the evolution of the reform movement's position on Zionism. We were initially an anti-Zionist movement, and I was curious to know how we had come to a place where we encourage people to travel to Israel. That was part of the reason my synagogue had encouraged me to go, and just explored that history. And anyway, from that moment, I renewed that desire to become a rabbi. I suddenly realized I didn't have to feel completely safe and at home in the entirety of the Jewish community, but I was energized by the struggles as much as I was by the comfort, if that makes sense. I was motivated to dig deeper and to try to make things make sense, and to recognize that there were opportunities for change, both within Judaism and outside, and using Judaism to impact the larger world and all of that. And then it was a straight shot for me into the seminary. So somewhere in all of that, I do think there are continuing driving forces that I see in my rabbinate and in my lived Judaism today.
Yeah. Thank you. What a beautiful story too of going into the dissonance. When I think, I know I can share for many of the congregants of our church, there's a great dissonance with much of, if not most of, Christianity as practiced in the Deep South. So it's it's a real struggle for, I think, all of us. So, and it's really helpful to hear you speak about it from your own tradition, and brings much to mind. And I think some tensions too about maybe the limits of our engagement with, it. How do I want to put this, everyone? Some of us are pluralists and some of us are not. and that's a difficult place to be. Now I'm speaking from within the Christian tradition for a moment, but
Mhm.
um, I've got room for many varieties of Christians. They don't all have room for me, and I think that's a fair thing to say. And I know other traditions experience those dynamics. So,
Absolutely.
Stephanie, this is related. I mean, one of my questions for you was um, that one of the in my own experience, so I'm 50, one of the defining struggles in my own life and in the churches that I've grown up in has been the issue of women's equality in the church, particularly women's ordination and leadership in the church, and whether women are treated equally to men or not. Um, and that's been a fight. You know, the churches I grew up in fought over that, and my parents chose churches that affirmed women fully and equally. But we knew that that was a fight, and we took a side. You know, and that's been defining, I think, for a number of the people in at Circular Church as well. And I just wondered what it had been like for you within the Reform movement, or within Reform Judaism, and just what it was like for you as a woman in religious leadership. What was your experience? May have been different than many of ours, but I'd love to hear what it has been like for you and what it feels like to you now.
Sure. Um, so it's a hard question because it really gets at very real experience, and some of which um, I didn't pay as much attention to as it was happening because you just you get through it, and if there are obstacles that are in your way because of your gender and you can't control your gender, then you just got to find ways around the obstacles. But we're at a moment right now in the reform movement of reckoning. There have been some
Mm,
major stories and news and press and studies that have come out of that. The first major report has just been published by an independent firm that looked at the seminary I attended, um, and found that there have been some egregious cases of not just you know gender discrimination, but actual abuse and some horrible things that have happened. Naming some people that were my professors, people that I know that I studied with, it just calls a lot into question. Um, Things that are less disturbing on one level than that, but one of the things the report showed was until 2016, um, the the smicha, the ordination certificate that rabbis get when we become rabbis. We didn't know that until 2016, a woman's certificate and a man's certificate did not say the same thing. So I read this report, and my husband's a rabbi. I looked at my smicha certificate, and I looked at his, and I looked at my colleague Greg Cantor's down the hall. The men, were ordained as I think it's Morenu Rabbeinu, something like it. Our leader, the rabbi, and then it lists their name. For women, it says the rabbi and teacher. We're not. It doesn't say leader on ours. And is it a huge deal? No. Is the discrepancy a big deal? Yes. I mean, it's not the the language that's so upsetting. It's the fact that when they began to ordain women as rabbis, they were ordaining them, but they weren't necessarily ordaining them to be the same thing.
mm,
And then it just wasn't shared. And now we know. They changed it again. They changed it in 2016, apparently quietly, because most of us looked at our smichot and said, "What?" Suddenly. Um, so things like that have been difficult to kind of just wrap your head around. And then in the process of finding jobs as a female rabbi, I've had the unique experience, although not so unique. There are lots of rabbis married to each other, but I've been through the placement process as a spouse, and I've been through the placement process as a rabbi. And I've watched as my husband, in numerous interviews, was never once asked how having a family would impact his ability to serve a congregation. And how every single time I've interviewed, and I'm sorry to say, but no shame here, it's just what it is. KKB is no exception. every single place that I've interviewed, I was asked how having children would impact my ability to be a rabbi in the congregation. Would I be available? What if I had more children? If we once we had one child, um, so things like that. Which is that legal? No, but do you have to answer the question? Yes, because it's reflecting a concern that the community has. To me, the issue isn't the question; the issue is the concern, and it's been a bit of a burden to feel like you always have to prove, at least for a certain amount of time, that you're willing to put a congregation before your family, um, or that you have enough capital invested in the position that you can help to educate the congregation that sometimes it's okay to put your family first, but you got to earn that before you can necessarily do it. So it's somewhat painful to share, but it's been the truth of my story and my journey.
Yeah. Thank you for, I mean, I think the painful part is the part we all need to hear and acknowledge. And I wondered, Stephanie, too, my early impressions of Charleston moving here from Houston in 2012, where half of my colleagues were always women, and seems like half of city council and leaders, and we moved here, and I was quite frankly surprised by how male everything felt. um, and I wonder, what your impressions were of moving to Charleston as a woman
Yeah,
in leadership in the community. I don't want to lead anymore. I wondered
yeah. It's
what it was like for you.
so I smile because one of the first phone calls I received at my desk was from a textbook publishing company that said, "We understand you're the first female rabbi to ever serve a congregation in the state of South Carolina. We'd like to put your picture in the textbook." Now, at least I knew enough at that moment to say, I don't know what else is going in the South Carolina history textbook. No, thank you. And to keep my name out of it. But if I hadn't realized that this was something special, or something that was going to be focused upon because it was relatively singular, then at that moment I absolutely did. Um, yeah, I've been really blessed. There have not been a tremendous number of female clergy here in town, but there are some fantastic. You and I know them
Right.
jointly. Some dynamic, brilliant, wonderfully capable female clergy here in Charleston, and so I'm grateful to be in their company. But we are also the beneficiaries of wonderful male identifying colleagues like yourself, Jeremy, who, I don't know that any of us ever feel like our gender is at play when we're in conversations with you all. So others, not so much me. I know others of our female colleagues in Cajun in particular have talked about some of the battles they've had to fight against their boards, and where gender was singled out, where all male congregational boards really overpowered the leadership of female clergy, trying to take them into these difficult waters that Cajun goes into. But it has not been a tremendous um, burden or issue for me now that I'm established here.
Okay, good. Um, that's good and somewhat surprising to hear, but I'm glad. And
Or I'm oblivious. I've just gotten to that point where, you know what? maybe, I don't know.
um, and even as you say that, Stephanie, my mind goes to panels of almost all men in
Hmm.
Columbia in the State House making decisions for all women, and making decisions over and for women's bodies. And so I think you and I have talked about this a little bit. I think those struggles continue, and there's a great deal at stake. So that um, we have that fight every year or every time
Hmm.
the assembly sits in Columbia, but I think it's becoming ever more serious now. So
It is. And as I shared with you a little while ago, in conversation, for me, the specific issue of abortion, well, I wholeheartedly agree with you that it's a question of denying women the medical agency that anybody else would be granted in making decisions in consultation with their medical professionals about their bodies and their care. Um, I think as we go forward in this fight, I'm invested in framing it as an issue of religious freedom, because so I have colleagues in the state of Texas who have written about the way that they've framed the law in Texas, which I think we can all safely assume that if South Carolina would love to do the same. They've made it illegal for at penalty of a substantial fine for anyone to counsel anybody regarding abortion, right? Well, in my tradition, there are times when abortion is not just permissible, but maybe even called for. When a woman's health is in danger and that health is expanded to mean, or understood to mean, I shouldn't say expanded, it's just understood to mean physical well-being, spiritual well-being, emotional well-being, mental well-being. And for her well-being, if a pregnancy needs to be terminated, that is counsel that my religious tradition would have me give. And I would be fined for giving that if I were in the state of Texas and maybe someday in the state of South Carolina. I hope not. But so I see it as an infringement upon not just a woman's ability to direct her own care, but to draw upon her faith tradition and to counsel with those that she would counsel with in making such a difficult and deeply personal decision. To deny her that access is religious discrimination as well.
Amen. Amen. And I think so much of this, I don't want to do too much with this, and I want to be mindful and come to some questions that the group might have. One of my concerns is I think I have an overall concern with groups of people in political power now and who don't affirm pluralism, who don't have room for difference, who don't have room for the wonderful diversity that makes up this country. And so I worry all the time about our politics and about where things are going. When, I lived in Texas for more years than I've lived anywhere else, and all my people are from there. So I know it fairly well. And that's a state that lives under minority rule because of the way the gerrymandering has been done and the way the levers of power get pulled. Or that government of the state of Texas does not represent the people that I know, and it does not represent the majority of people, and it doesn't celebrate the pluralism that is a city like Houston,
Yep.
For example. So I didn't mean to get on a soapbox, but I worry about that often. So.
No, piggyback on that. Every year I teach our confirmation class at KKB. That's our 10th grade students predominantly. Sometimes we've got an 11th grader in there too. Every year they have stories of discrimination, anti-Semitism to share. Some that have happened that year or from years prior. And sometimes things are as they're happening. So for example, a student whose coach demands that the team pray together before a game, and a student will say no, and the student will be benched and not get to start or maybe even play, or a requirement to be a part of a Christian fellowship organization separate and apart from the team, but if you're not involved in that, you can't start. Or maybe, and I'll stick with the sports thing, maybe you have to have perfect attendance at practices and things to be able to start for your team, but one of those practices is on a high holy day and you don't attend the practice, and so you don't get to start, right? Any other place I've been, and I don't know if it's a function of geography or a function of time, because by definition it was earlier, or a combination of the two most likely. If I heard stories like that and I or the student or the parent brought that issue and educated, right, about the pluralism, about the people that you have on your team, Maybe you just didn't know, right? It would get changed. If it didn't get changed, you'd have to elevate it maybe one level. You tell a principal, and it's going to get changed. That doesn't happen here. They it's not ignorance, or at least once you've educated them, it can no longer be ignorance. It's now a willful disregard for pluralistic environment in which various it's deeply disturbing and upsetting, but we see it every single year, and every single student has encountered it in some capacity.
But I think it paints a picture for us of our shared work, or some of our shared work going forward. And I do want to be, I still have too many questions and I can come to them, but I do want to be mindful of the lovely group here. And so I'm looking at the comments quickly. Well, Jeannie mentions that you were magnificent in the 3 rabbi presentation on sexuality at the College of Charleston. Jeannie, if you'd like to expand, we can happily go to you. You just thumbs up. I think you're still on mute, Jeannie. It's
I got it.
there
Okay.
you go.
You were magnificent with those 3 rabbis. And I just love the Hebrew study program at the College of Charleston. I think it's the greatest thing in the world. Yeah. And I love the Jewish Historical Society too, and been following that. And just congratulations on your beautiful son. And also, have you read anything by this gentleman? We are now studying this. He's an Israeli. We're now studying this in a philosophy society. It's 21 lessons for the 21st century, and he's a historian philosopher. So I'm hoping to learn something from him. Have you heard of him or read up?
I have heard of him. I have not read anything by him, but I'd love to know your impressions of his writing style. I think he wrote something about like the history of humanity, right?
Sapiens.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And also, I was very fond of Tony Holtz and Rabbi Rudinsky and his wife, and they were active in teaching clinical pastoral education, which I was so grateful for. Are you involved with that at all?
With the CPE program? I am not, but I can tell you. So we just saw Rabbi Holtz virtually. He recorded a beautiful, just sweet, touching Hanukkah message for us for our rededication, and we were able to include him in the service on Saturday morning. And thank God he and Judy and their family are doing well.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Yeah. Marty, my son was in school with Marty's Permuta's son at the College of Charleston. So I've seen those boys grow up, and what he has done with that program. I don't know how involved you are with the Hebrew Center there, but I'm just so impressed.
They do wonderful work. Absolutely.
Good. It's good to hear that. So good to see you.
You too.
Thanks, Jeannie. And Bill Epps, you had a question, and I'm happy to let you put it in your own words if you want.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Rabbi, and good to see you. Yeah, I tend to go long, so I'll try to go short on this one. I just, these are 2 of several historic congregations in Charleston, and I wondered if as senior clergy in your respective institutions, if you could just, if you can call forth a moment in the history of the congregation that helped you understand its connection to the wider Charleston community. Cajun is clearly a connection here. I'm wondering if you could go a little further back.
Well, no shortage of moments to choose from, right? With such a long history, and it's easy to just say, okay, well, the moment that we put in an organ at KKBE and effectively became the first Reformed congregation in America, that's probably like winning moment number one. But actually, there's not to belabor Cajun, and I don't want to, but if you consider the distance traveled, when we know that a rabbi that was very outspoken about civil rights issues, though it might have been partly the way in which he was outspoken. It might be the fact that he came to Charleston with the agenda of, if I'm in the South and I'll be able to impact these issues, and maybe dove in a little too quickly without building up relationships first. I read an article once that highlighted the fact that his wife didn't really, open the parsonage for people to come and visit. Maybe that was enough of a turnoff. I don't know. But there was a rabbi in the 60s who was essentially relieved of their duties and moved on to something else because of their involvement in civil rights. So I do not for a moment take for granted KKBE's ability to be one of the founding congregations of the Charleston Area Justice Ministry, and part of the the importance of our involvement, I think, it's for our own sake to be able to appreciate that journey. But we also remind ourselves continuously, whether it's Cajun or certain other areas, if we think this is important work for the Jewish community to be involved in, there aren't a lot of other places where the Jewish community can stand up. KKBE has got to be willing to do that. And in some cases where we have seen other parts of the Jewish community willing to get involved, for a time, another one of the congregations was engaged with some work with the mosque. There are some other issues here and there. We've ceded that to their leadership so that we can continue to be in the places where others are not showing up. And I'm proud of the congregation for recognizing that responsibility we have to the Jewish community and to our faith.
Amen. And I kind of want to echo, Bill, the story that I thought of immediately was not a pre-Cajun story. So I'll try to give both quickly, if you don't mind. But I think with circular with the civil rights struggle itself, there was a struggle within the congregation over integration and advocating for civil rights. And from what I'm told, the story as it's passed down to me is there was concern that the church could, the windows would be broken or the church would be vandalized. It was too dangerous to take that kind of stand. And two leaders in the church, Bill and Kay Sharp in particular, that I know stood up and said, we don't support segregated businesses and we won't support a segregated church either. And they walked out and said they wouldn't return until the church was committed to justice, but that was a struggle. That was, there was much on the line and people were afraid and there was disagreement over the best path forward. And so, Stephanie, when you said that, to imagine, the distance traveled, I thought of Bill and Kay Sharp, and now we have a room. We don't, this is just our church practice. We name things after people, not for donations, but as an honorific to recognize what they have done. If you get something named after you at Circular, it's just because we thought you were extraordinary and we want to honor you in that way. So there's one of our meeting rooms is the Sharp Room. And I think of them every time I go through that doorway, and I sort of imagine that moment when they stood. And I want to say briefly, mindful of time, and Eric, I see your question. We'll come right to you. But in my own time here, which has been almost 10 years, there was a moment after we'd been involved in the justice ministry for a few years, I suppose, and we invited Reverend Nelson Rivers to preach at Circular. And I realized during the service, as the service was beginning, it started to occur to me that I had no idea what I had done, like what the power of what I had done. And it started to occur to me because Reverend Rivers brought his mom and his wife and the whole church choir. And it was extraordinary to see the place filling up with dear friends from charity. And then when Reverend Rivers got up to preach, he started in the most personal way. And he told a story about being a little boy in Charleston and riding his bicycle down Meeting Street. And he got to Calhoun, and a white person stopped him and said, "You so-and-so," used an epithet, said, you can't come south of Calhoun. You have to go back." He told this story in the pulpit, and he said, look at me now. Look where I am now by invitation. And the power of that moment, I think for everyone who was there, helped us to understand that there were things so much greater than we were. We were just touching on them, but we had the power to really do something helpful that we barely understood. I think, and I think that's just one of the moments I'll never forget. And I hope that, church isn't always like that. Religious communities don't always get it that right. But every once in a while, we're able to do something extraordinary together. So, but it's the together part that makes that moment. And so I got a little lost in a reverie there. Go ahead.
Can I take a tangent from there? And I know there's another question waiting, but so for those who don't know, I'll say I was deeply privileged to be in the company of Jeremy and Reverend Rivers in receiving an award for involvement in racial justice work. And Jeremy, unfortunately, was not well the day that we received this award in Columbia. But Reverend Rivers and I were able to be present. We held up Jeremy's name on a sign. But same experience. He came with his mother, who I miss dearly, his wife, his family, his grandchildren, a bus full of people from Charity Missionary Baptist Church. And I remember thinking, I'm the baby here. Reverend Rivers has, how many accolades has this man received? I'm in awe every time I'm in his presence. And yet he celebrated that moment and he shared it with all of his family. And I in my life have not done nearly as good of a job of I don't even know what it is, of just absorbing life's experience and sharing it proudly with those who have been a part of the journey to get there. And I need to learn that better. But if anyone could have taken that moment for granted, it he had that right. He's just done so much in his life. I was blown away by that.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for the question. It took us to some really good places. And Erica, let's go to you. I'm eager to hear your question.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you all for sharing and taking the time for this. It's been really wonderful to listen to. So my spouse and I are interfaith. And as I've learned more about his faith tradition of Judaism, it's really deepened my understanding of my Christianity. I know Jeremy in his sermons and writing talks a lot about Buddhism and kind of how that intermingles with Christianity. So I was just wondering, are there ways that either Christian theology or other faith theology has deepened your understanding of Jewish theology and traditions?
It's a fantastic question, and one that's going to take me a moment to think about. I mean, again, I'll have to. I know Cajun looms so large in this work, but it's not even it's Cajun. It's that's the organization that has brought me into such constant and close camaraderie with the colleagues that I get to call friends down here. Um, and I'm always touched and moved and yeah, I would say too, like my faith deepened by the words that I hear my colleagues teach and preach and share. Um, I, I mean, top of the list. I mean, Reverend Rivers is a he's just a dynamic human being, unparalleled, and there's no match there. But if you ever get the chance to hear Reverend Cece Armstrong, hear her teach as well as preach. Teach. She brings text to life. Um, and the texts that are a part of my tradition, she'll go to the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament in Christian parlance, and just um, the way that she can illuminate a moment in text and invite us to inhabit that space and feel it from the inside. Um, one of the things that KJM has done is a monthly or bi-monthly clergy study opportunity, and I'm not always able to make them, but certainly if I see her name attached to it, I make every effort to be able to be there because I know I'm not giving you a specific example here, but just I know that it's going to be a moment when my own faith and my own understanding of my tradition is going to be deepened because of what she's taught. I'm sorry there's no specifics attached to that, but it's just been a constant experience for me.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Erica, I'll add this. You didn't ask me exactly, but Stephanie sort of brought it. Stephanie, when you say Old Testament, I want to say of a generation. We already had stopped saying that. So we were all trained to say Hebrew Bible because it was deeply disrespectful of Jewish friends to, it's sort of supersessionist to act like there was a new and better testament. But so we read the Hebrew Bible as the Hebrew Bible and read Tanakh and read it in Hebrew, probably not too well, but we at least took a year of Hebrew to try to, make a good attempt and really studied the prophetic tradition in particular and the wisdom writings and the Psalms. All of these things are constitutive elements. They're essential to my faith. And the joke is that after the first year of seminary, we all wanted to become Jewish because it was so much richer to us than some of the Christianity that had been presented to us. And those texts, Hebrew Bible texts, came to life in such a way. It didn't hurt that I had an exceptional Hebrew professor, who could probably have made the phone book come to life, but he had such incredible source material to work with, and centuries of interpretation to work with, and we just delighted in that. So, Erica, I know you didn't ask me exactly, but I just wanted to say a word about how Judaism and the prophetic tradition and wisdom writings in particular have just remain at the core for me. And if you were to audit my preaching for the last 20 years, and I wouldn't recommend that, it would be prophetic texts, wisdom writings, Psalms, and Jesus gospel stories. And you would find very little of the Christian Testament epistles. This is me. I mean, other preachers differ in their sort of the way they're wired, but yeah, I think the texts that I mentioned speak to our predicament, or speak to us existentially and spiritually still. So sorry, got a little preachy, friends.
Occupational hazard.
Right. And I'll keep my eye for questions. Stephanie, I do have one I have lots more, but I'll stop with this last one. Along prophetic lines, were there prophetic figures for you, either within the texts or people like Heschel or other figures who we may not know as well? For you in particular, were there people, or it could be, you know, someone you knew who spoke up against their coach who was requiring something, you know? I mean, prophetic figures take many forms.
I'm deeply fascinated by Heschel, and one of the saddest things for me that has been lost to the pandemic, at least temporarily, is I was awarded a research fellowship to go to Duke, where they have all of Heschel's papers. And my proposal was to be able, just from what I got a glimpse in the the categories that everything they have up online, is that we've only skimmed the surface of understanding the depth with which he was willing to dive down into individual issues. It wasn't just broad umbrella statements that he made about Vietnam or he made about race. I mean, he got down into the particulars, into the places where people tell us don't go that far deep, right? He did, and he also, from what I saw online, and I was excited to see more, I think he spoke out about way more issues than we ever give him credit for as well. I think he spoke out on the environment. I saw preliminary indications that he spoke up about gun violence, some of that deeply impacted by what he was seeing in Vietnam. He signed on to a statement about abortion. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff there. So I think we've done ourselves a disservice by sort of watering down Heschel, and I kind of want to get in there and what they've done with, who's the, sorry, just happened to have it nearby, but right, the Radical King. I think there's a much more radical Heschel than we've been willing to hold up, and since so many people like King are invested in Heschel, what better place to expose for being far more radical than we give him credit. So yeah, and then also his theology. I mean, the idea that the best work we can do comes from identifying with the divine pathos. Feel what God feels, and if you feel that, you're going to be directed toward the best end that you can. That the concept of radical amazement, just if you can find a way to wake up every morning and just allow yourself to be blown away by what's there. Jeremy, you and I were talking the other day about the miracle of our bodies that we take for granted. Our liturgy reminds us this, life experience reminds us that it works far more often than it doesn't, and that's miraculous. So Heschel would draw our attention to things like that. So in so many ways, he's I guess like Reverend Rivers. He's in a class unto himself. But there was another theologian who's still living, and I did not have the chance to study with her in the seminary. I think she teaches out at the in the LA community. But I read, it was Engendering Judaism, I think was the name of the book, by Rachel Adler. And I remember specifically studying in my liturgy class with Larry Hoffman, who is another deeply influential teacher and mentor in my personal history. I remember studying her paradigm for a Jewish wedding, right? I mean, a traditional Jewish wedding is not an egalitarian experience. That you have a groom and a bride. So first off, it's gendered, right? And the groom places a ring on the bride's finger and recites a certain formula, and effectively the bride becomes the groom's wife. And we've made that egalitarian by having the bride reciprocate the same language and put a ring on her groom's finger, and we call it done. And Rachel Adler said, we don't have to accept that as being egalitarian enough. The paradigm of marriage in this ritual construct is one of purchase. It's one of ownership. That's what the ring signifies. It's something of value that's being transferred, and you are claiming someone as yourself. why have that go both ways? How about mining Jewish tradition for a completely different paradigm? And she came up with shutafut, with the category not of ownership, but of partnership. And there was a ritual in which two individuals would join into partnership with one another in the context of business, as it's recorded in text. They would hold up together an object of value, and there was specific language that went with it. And she recommended instead of just reciprocating something that is by its very nature one person in power over the other, let's use this other model, which is as authentically Jewish as the other one. It's just carried over from a different part of Jewish tradition. That blew my mind because it just opened up the possibility for every aspect of Jewish life, that you're not locked in to tradition as it exists. You have the entire wealth of Jewish tradition at your disposal to be able to manipulate and be creative with and experiment with and see if something fits better over here. Maybe you like the purpose, but you don't like the form. Maybe you like the form, but it needs a different purpose. They're all variables that we control. And it radically expanded my understanding of how Jewish ritual can be deployed. So those are two, I mean, Heschel, but Adler stands out for that deep impact on my rabbinate.
Thanks. Well, and that something about that also strikes me as prophetic, taking the in an extremely creative way, well, the refashioning of ritual to express something much more, in this case, egalitarian, much more just.
Right. Or I guess if you look at systemic places where systems are broken, maybe you can repair it, but if the system was originally flawed, then you need a new system, and that doesn't mean that you're throwing out it's precedent for so much creative work that can be done in the betterment of so many things.
I think that gives our imaginations good places to go as we kind of conclude for the evening. I'm just making sure no one had a question that went unanswered. If you did have a question you wanted to be sure to ask, now is probably the time to do that, friends, at least for this conversation. Although, the good news is that we are neighbors and we are colleagues, and our congregations are kindreds in many ways. And so the conversation always continues. And for me, the best part of living in Charleston are the people who live here, and our colleagues and friends, and the birds. So the natural beauty and the people keep it beautiful. Excuse me. And Candace did have a comment, it looks like, appreciating a film brought to the terrace. Yes. Candace, do you want to say more?
Yes. I just sort of love the sort of pre-pandemic. I was at the movies all the time, and I remember just I'm not sure if it was the Jewish Hebrew Society. I'm not really sure, but it was bringing a film called Dancing in Jafra. Do you remember seeing that?
I didn't see it, but there's a Jewish film series in town, and they do, and they continue to bring films. I think that now that can be watched virtually as well as in person.
Yes, it was so wonderful. It was like sort of the experience of this man who came to teach the Palestinian children and the Jewish children to dance together. And it was just so beautifully filmed, and it was a true experience of, dancing is always awkward anyways when you're, a young person, and here they were dancing with a Palestinian child, or you know what I mean, a Jewish child, and together, but it was so well done. Just imagining the world differently.
Yeah,
you know, where there could be peace among children.
absolutely.
It was
That
really
sounds very
beautiful.
inspiring. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mostly, if we just watch what our kids are able to do together when we remove ourselves from the equation, I think we can all see what things could be like. Right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
I muted myself. If we could only learn to be ourselves as children again, or to be a little more childlike at times. But well, Stephanie, thanks so much for being with us
My pleasure.
this evening and in life. So, and thanks, friends, for joining us for this. If you're interested in more of these conversations, just send us a message over at the church office. We can make sure that you're on the list for theology and ethics. But it's good to be together in this way, and stay safe and well. And if you need someone, give the church a call if we can help. We're around for each other. So
Thank you so
have a great
much. It
wedding
was
tonight.
wonderful. Wonderful
Thank
to
you
see
all.
everybody.